You're listening to Past Imperfect, a global and Indian history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom in Leadership at SPJIMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. It has been 180 years since the beginning of the Great Famine in Ireland, an event so devastating that, even today, the population of Ireland is lower than it was on the eve of the famine. Padraic X. Scanlan, author of Rot, A History of the Irish Famine, joins us today to discuss why this horrific event remains so important to understand and remember. The famine, Scanlan tells us, was fundamentally a modern phenomenon, a product of global capitalism and ideas about the infallibility of the market. Principles of the free market triumphed over humanitarianism, a chilling occurrence which, Scanlan reminds us, has not been an outlier in the broader history of capitalism. Thank you, Padraic, for joining us today. I want to begin with a question that might seem quite obvious, but I think is important to address. Your book, of course, covers the Great Irish Famine from the 1840s, and this is an event from 180 years ago in Ireland. Why is it important to raise awareness of this particular historical episode 180 years later, not just outside the Ireland or the Irish diaspora or the Anglophone world, but globally at a global level?
I mean, I think what the Irish Famine teaches in terms of present day lessons is the profound hazard of two things. First of all, is a kind of unquestioning faith in the power of markets to solve social issues, right? Because I think one of the features of the Irish Famine, both in its causes and in its actual unfolding, was the kind of collision between Britain's faith in the power of the free market to improve institutions, to improve quality of life, and also to solve the crisis of subsistence in Ireland and the reality. So in that sense, I think, obviously the capacities and powers of states today are vastly greater than they were. Even in, Britain in 1845 was probably the world's most powerful state and the world's most powerful industrial empire, but, it was still paled in comparison to the capacities of the present day states. But at the same time, I think it's evidence that that kind of faith in market logic can result in disastrous, unexpected consequences. And I think the other lesson from the Irish Famine has a lot to do with the sort of unexpected consequences of monoculture, right? I think the Irish Famine was in part a consequence of Ireland's profound biological dependence on the potato. And I think a lot of the unfolding of the famine occurred because of the inability of either the British state for market-based reasons or Irish farmers for the same reasons to shift crops or try to find a way through the famine by growing something else. So, I'm not trying to tell a sort of, I didn't present the book as a kind of fable for the present, but I think those are lessons that we can draw from it.
So the free market and faith in the free market is obviously a very important part of your book. And the other part is ruling ideology, or in this case, a colonialist ideology. You describe in your book that the rot was not just in the potatoes, it was in the colonialist mentalities that British rulers had towards the Irish. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your views on Ireland's particular political status in this era. I mean, on the one hand, a member of the Union, on the other hand, a subject territory. And how the famine helps crystallize Ireland's particular political position at this moment.
Right. I mean, I think one of the big questions that I was trying to answer in the book, and one that actually came pretty easily, was the question of Ireland's status as a subject of British colonialism, as an object of British colonialism, because Ireland was never formally a British colony. So Ireland was conquered in the Middle Ages and became a sister kingdom for a while, and then eventually was in 1801 absorbed into the United Kingdom. So, Ireland from 1801 had 100 MPs sitting in Westminster. Its population comprised about a third of the total population of the United Kingdom. Irish bishops, or at least Irish Protestant bishops, sat in the House of Lords. Irish aristocrats had their own permanent seats in the House of Lords, right? Ireland supplied a pretty substantial number of professionals and imperial administrators and colonial soldiers, right? So Ireland and the Irish participated in Britain's colonial and imperial projects outside of the United Kingdom, right? There were an awful lot of Irish personnel on the front lines of British imperial expansion and colonial rule. But within Ireland, I mean, the purpose, although it may never necessarily have been the kind of explicit intended purpose of Ireland within the United Kingdom, was as a source of cheap labor, rent, and agricultural products for the British market. And so, it's not necessarily that providing agricultural products or providing labor makes colonialism. But within the context of the United Kingdom, right, you had these two ostensible equal partners in a new polity where one of the partners was effectively getting poorer and poorer by the year while the other got richer and richer. And so I think that relationship strikes me as colonial. And I think the attitude of many Britons towards the Irish Catholic poor is also characteristically colonial, right? I don't think that every single, it wasn't a kind of universal, a sort of universal attitude toward the Irish, but toward the majority of the Irish, Britain's attitude was distinctively colonial, right? The Irish were seen as chronologically distant from the rest of Britain and sort of trapped in a different time. They were seen as alien, as not exactly subhuman, but as a kind of like previous, they're simian, right? I think there's a lot of racialization to the way that the Irish Catholic poor were portrayed, and a lot of characteristically colonial attitudes toward the majority of the Irish. So in that sense, although the United Kingdom didn't colonize Ireland, I think the position of Ireland within the United Kingdom and within the British Empire was colonial.
Yeah, and while reading a book, I was reminded of many of the attitudes that the British rulers had towards, say, Hindus in India, or the attitudes they had towards elements of Indian society. But as you mentioned, Ireland was obviously very different from other colonial entities within the British Empire. And there was one particular description you have of Ireland that really stuck with me, which was your description of Irish poverty being disconcertingly modern. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how this was possible. I mean, you have the world's richest country on the one hand, right? I mean, you have places like London and Manchester and Liverpool, which are the absolute epitome of modernity and technological sophistication and, the centers of global finance. And just a few miles away across the Irish Sea, you have this territory, which, as you mentioned, is getting poorer and poorer every year. And the poverty is modern. I wonder if you could unpack that a bit.
Sure. So I think no one in the United Kingdom disputed Ireland's poverty. So it's not as though Irish poverty was concealed from British officials. But when a lot of people like Charles Trevelyan, people like Nassau William Sr., to a lesser extent, people like Malthus, who actually stayed pretty far away from Ireland. I think he only wrote one major essay on it, and he wrote it anonymously in a magazine. But when they surveyed Ireland's poverty, they saw a sort of disjuncture in time, right? They imagined that the Irish poor were kind of like medieval peasants or early modern peasants who had somehow found themselves in a modern state and were unable, due to their lack of civilization, lack of modernity, to adapt to the demands of that modern state. And that's why they were poor, right? So it was poor because they did not understand how to behave as modern economic subjects. But what I try to argue in Rot is that, in fact, their poverty was the poverty of a kind of poverty characteristic of unequal capitalist societies that was distinctively modern. So the Irish poor weren't poor because they didn't understand the market. They were poor because when they had to participate in the market, they had to participate in conditions of such profound precarity and risk that if they made a misstep, they would inevitably fall deeper into poverty. So one of the things that I try to focus on in one of the chapters in Rot is the way that the potato crop, which British officials considered to be evidence of Ireland's backwardness, was in fact a kind of high stakes opportunity for a lot of Irish agricultural laborers to bet on the outcome of their harvest, right? So if they had enough potatoes, they had to always make the decision about whether they would sell them, feed them to their pigs, give them to their landlord. They had all of these economic decisions to make. And the margin of error on those decisions was extraordinarily thin. So if they made the wrong decision, they might not have a place to live the next year. They might be forced to emigrate. They might starve to death. They might fall further down the socioeconomic ladder. So it wasn't a kind of poverty that was the poverty of people who didn't understand the free market. It was the poverty of people who were trapped in a negative feedback loop within the free market. And that strikes me as being very much a modern kind of poverty. And so I think that the kind of aesthetics of rural Ireland made it hard for a lot of officials to see it. But, Irish agricultural laborers understood the logic of the market. They just couldn't escape from it.
Yeah, again, I mean, something which has eerie parallels to what went on in India with increasing impoverization in the late 19th century. So potatoes, of course, were subsistence crops across large parts of Western and Eastern Europe and in parts of the Americas. But as you note, they were particularly vital in Ireland. How precisely did the potato support the economic and social structure in Ireland on the precipice of the famine?
Right. So, as you say, red potatoes came to Europe with the Columbian Exchange, and they were widely adopted by peasants and smallholders across Europe, in part because they were such a useful backstop against famine. Right. A potato can be hidden in the ground. Potatoes can provide really large yields without having to store seed because you can plant them. I mean, most potatoes, even virtually all potatoes that are planted commercially, are planted as sets rather than as seeds. They're cloned. So, I think potatoes had all of these advantages that European farmers were really quick to identify. And that was the case in Ireland, as it was the case in Poland and Prussia, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Britain, across the potato belt, across sort of northwestern Europe. But in Ireland, because of the unique position of Ireland as a colony that was, only, a few at its furthest, a few hundred kilometers away from its colonial overlord, right? Like Ireland was a colony that was extraordinarily close to its metropole. The dependence on potatoes in the Irish countryside increased as the demands on the Irish economy, made first by Britain and then later by the United Kingdom, also increased. So, what started out as a kind of backstop crop for Irish farmers, something that would replace, say, oatmeal or other staples when those crops failed or when prices fell or when there was weather or economic disruption of any kind, slowly became, instead of a backstop crop, it became a staple crop. And in Ireland, as the process of extraction from the Irish economy increased in the 18th and in the 19th century, the dependence on potatoes grew deeper and deeper, right? So potatoes had this function where they could keep people alive, earning very small wages, but at the same time, make it possible to grow other crops for rent. So the potato allowed wages to fall, allowed rents to rise, and allowed both of those processes to take place without having the labor force starve to death, right? So the potato had this paradoxical effect for Irish agricultural laborers in that it was both wildly abundant, especially in good years and especially at harvest time, but at the same time was incrementally deepening the precariousness and vulnerability and fragility of the Irish economy. So it had this kind of, it was both the thing on which the Irish poor depended, but also the thing that was making them poorer and poorer season after season.
A double-edged sword of sorts.
Exactly.
So I want to turn to the response that the British government makes initially to the famine. So obviously you have a very long history of racist attitudes towards the Irish on behalf of the British and English elite, but layered on top of that is this kind of newfound orthodoxy and faith in the free market. And on top of that, as you mentioned, there are all these other debates that are going on in the British political arena. The Corn Laws are being repealed. It's been a few years since the Reform Act of 1833, abolition of slavery. Could you talk about how the Irish famine kind of figures in all of these other debates that are going on in Britain at the time?
Yeah, it's a complicated. That's a more. I'll have to chop that up into smaller pieces. So I'll start with the Reform Act, right, of 1832. And in that sense, Ireland was sort of outside of the rest of the United Kingdom because the Reform Act reformed constituencies across England, Ireland, and Wales, right? But Ireland's primary electoral reform came a little earlier in 1829 with Catholic emancipation, which restored Catholic civil rights across Ireland, but at the same time increased the economic requirement to vote. The 40 shilling freehold, right, meant that although all of a sudden, Catholics were permitted to vote and stand for office for Irish constituencies, a much smaller number of Irish citizens or Irish citizens in the United Kingdom got the franchise. So in that sense, Ireland's kind of trajectory democratically was on a downward slope while the rest of the United Kingdom was on an upward slope. So in that sense, right, Ireland's meaningful political representation in the House of Commons was roughly divided between like the representatives of the old Anglo-Irish gentry who were staunchly unionist and the representatives of the upwardly mobile Catholic middle class represented by Daniel O'Connell, who were nationalist, but not in the kind of Republican sense that emerged after the famine. So, both of these big political parties, I guess, although I'm not sure they would have considered themselves to be part. Both of these two big political factions among Irish MPs were not invested necessarily in democratic representation. They had two different visions of where Ireland stood. One was within the Union, and the other was within under the overarching umbrella of the United Kingdom, but with the clock turned back to an era when Ireland was an independent parliament under the British Crown, right? And so, in that sense, Ireland was not really a part of parliamentary reform in the same way that, for example, Manchester or Liverpool or the big industrial cities were. In terms of the abolition of slavery, I think in some ways that's where I came to write from. Right, I spent a big chunk of my earlier career writing about British slavery and anti-slavery, and especially anti-slavery. And I think I came to Irish agricultural laborers through the era of apprenticeship that followed the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. So Britain abolished colonial slavery in most of the empire in 1833. The law came into effect in 1834, and formerly enslaved people were almost immediately pressed into service as unpaid laborers who were called apprentices, right? So a majority of agricultural laborers who had once been enslaved now had to work for 40 and a half hours a week for the people who had once claimed to own them, so that they could ostensibly learn the discipline of wage labor. And then the rest of their working time, they were partly encouraged and partly compelled to sell to whoever would buy it, right? To kind of educate the formerly enslaved workforce in the rhythms and routines and disciplines of wage labor. And, I think there were a lot of comparisons made in that era in Ireland and in the Caribbean between Irish agricultural laborers who were always free, right, had never been enslaved within the British Empire, but were still considered to be kind of on that bottom step of a ladder of civilization, and formerly enslaved laborers who, after their emancipation, were considered to have just sort of taken that first step toward the ladder, right? So they seem to be more or less in the same position. And so in that sense, the abolition of colonial slavery in the British Empire was critically important for valorizing wage labor at any cost, right? I think after abolition, it became easy for British abolitionists to say that any kind of wage labor for any wage was part of a crucial civilizing process. And moreover, that the lower the wage, the more powerful that civilizing process was, because the less you were paid, the more likely you were to have to save your money, to act in an economically prudent way, to kind of marshal your resources in a way that was considered to be civilizing, right? So in that sense, the abolition of slavery is critically important to the way that Irish laborers were seen within the British Empire, both within that kind of imagined hierarchy of civilization, but also within an empire that was now entirely an empire of free labor, where comparisons between free laborers were much easier to make. The Corn Laws, though, I think in some ways, I think that's I think was this is sort of appears in rot out of nowhere, right? Because, you could write, and people have written shelves and shelves of books about the Corn Law debates. But Ireland's landlords benefited from the Corn Laws in the same way that Britain's landlords did. But Ireland's landlords got much more of their income and their power from rent rather than the sale of produce. So in that sense, Irish aristocrats were less profoundly invested in preserving the Corn Laws in comparison to sort of ultra Tories in England or in Wales, or especially in England, but also in Wales. But the abolition of the Corn Laws happened coincidentally with the first wave of the famine. And Robert Peel used the example of Ireland sometimes in his cabinet meetings to try to persuade his skeptical colleagues to pick up free trade, which had been the sort of a keystone policy of their political enemies, the Whigs, and adopt it as conservative policy instead. And so the abolition of the Corn Laws is entangled with the first wave of the Irish famine. But the degree to which Peel genuinely was using the Irish famine cynically or as a kind of political point to get his position across is kind of unclear to me. And Peel's biographers are divided on it. But it certainly took place at the same time as the famine was beginning. And in some ways, the debate over the Corn Laws overshadowed the deepening crisis in Ireland in the winter of 1846.
So in other works, sometimes you see a distinction made between the administration of Robert Peel, head of the Tory ministry, and John Russell, and his Whig ministry. And you see a distinction made between a supposedly humanitarian response made by Peel and for Russell, someone who stuck much more towards an orthodox free market approach towards dealing with the famine. But you completely rubbish this. You say that there's not really much of a distinction. Can you explain your position on this?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that I try to bring out in Rot, and this is not absent from other histories of the famine, but I think it's something that I especially emphasize, is the constant low level food scarcity in Ireland for decades before the famine. The potato had a very distinctive, very predictable cycle of huge harvests followed by declining supplies, followed by near starvation and scarcity. So for most Irish agricultural laborers, the autumn was a time of plenty. The winter was a time of slowly declining reserves of potatoes. And then the spring and especially the summer were periods of often pretty profound food scarcity. And in years where the potato crop was especially bountiful, that was lessened. But in years where the potato crop failed partially or where the potato crop was reduced, every summer was a summer of either near famine or actual famine, right? Certainly a subsistence crisis, if not true famine. And so I think that because of that, there was a pretty well developed policy playbook for the United Kingdom in relationship to Irish periods of scarcity. And it always hinged on preserving both the structure and the theoretical kind of disciplinary or civilizing power of the market over the Irish, right? So the basic model for relieving Irish food scarcity was to import food and sell it at cost, so that the Irish, it was seen as especially morally hazardous to give anybody something for nothing across all of Britain and the British Empire. But the less civilized you were seen to be, the greater the moral hazard, right? So giving, a middle class person in Britain down on their luck a free meal posed some kind of moral hazard of dependence, but to give an Irish agricultural laborer whose potato crop had failed free food posed a profound moral hazard. So you had to sell food at cost. And at the same time, in order to raise wages, you would have public works programs. So that basic playbook was exactly the playbook that was put into action, first by Peel and then by John Russell. They just kind of changed their emphasis. So in the first wave of the famine, Peel established public works, or his government established public works in Ireland. But the primary feature of famine relief policy was to buy American maize in huge quantities, import it to Ireland, and sell it at cost. And then in the second wave of the famine, after Peel fell from, Peel was driven out of office by his own party after the repeal of the Corn Laws. The Conservative Party broke into the Peelite free trading conservatives and the sort of rump protectionist conservatives or Tories. And then the Whigs took power, and John Russell didn't stop importing grain, except in 1846, 1847, there were poor harvests across Europe. So the demands on the American market were much greater and grain was much more expensive. So Russell turned to public works, which had existed under Peel. So in my view, both Peel and Russell had pretty similar views about the market and its kind of moral effects on the Irish poor. And both relied on basically similar policies to mitigate the consequences of the famine. They just changed their emphasis. So in some sense, right, I mean, I think Disraeli was just beginning his parliamentary career when Peel was about to fall in the spring of 1846. And, Disraeli's speeches in the House of Commons and George Bentinck's speeches in the House of Commons maybe hint at a slightly different attitude towards Irish poverty. But I think if either of them had been prime minister, they probably would have relied on the same mechanisms anyway, right? It was kind of easy for the ultra Tories to kind of offer this kind of paternalist, old-fashioned, pre-modern vision of Ireland because they weren't in government. I think effectively there was a model for Irish famine relief. It was premised on ideas about what Ireland was and where the Irish were within this hierarchy of civilization. And both Peel and Russell relied on the same basic set of policies.
And in addition to Peel and Russell, of course, the third big figure in the British famine response was Charles Trevelyan. And one thing I was surprised by in your book is that there's relatively little reference to Trevelyan, who, of course, had an Indian career after that. But I wanted to ask, was that a deliberate choice on your part?
I mean, I did obviously a lot of reading of the sort of classic histories of the famine. And I think there are kind of two broad paths in the historiography. I mean, there are others too, but just for the sake of, convenience, there are two. And one is the kind of economic history of the famine, which is primarily interested in figuring out Ireland's place within the British Empire and within the United Kingdom through the tools of econometric analysis. And then there are narrative histories of the famine. And I think still the best one is The Great Hunger by Cecil Woodham Smith. And in her book, Trevelyan is the villain, right? He is a kind of criminal mastermind almost, whose contempt for Ireland and the Irish is almost it's almost as though he sees the failure of the potato crop as an opportunity to kind of take revenge on Ireland, or to kind of inflict the final blow on an economy that he sees as being not only backward but also kind of immoral and Catholic. And I guess Trevelyan's attitudes toward Ireland were not as noteworthy as maybe Cecil Woodham Smith and others have made them out to be. I think in some ways he represented a pretty mainstream liberal position on where Ireland stood within the British Empire and what Ireland was within the British Empire. So Trevelyan, I think was in some ways, I think, like personalizing for the famine and saying it was Trevelyan's fault, I think helps to obscure the fact that the structures of the Irish economy were such that more or less anyone put in the position of administering famine relief, especially from the Chancellery of the Exchequer, which is where Trevelyan was based. Like, if the Treasury is responsible for administering Irish famine, which it was, right, I don't think you would have gotten a substantially different pattern of famine relief if somebody else had been in charge, right? I think Trevelyan was an extraordinarily gifted writer. And so his history of the famine is full of lines that are extremely quotable and extremely incriminating. He says a lot of stuff about Ireland and the Irish that is very easy to, package in quotation marks as evidence of Britain's attitudes toward Ireland, but he definitely was not exceptional. And so what I try to bring out in Rod is to emphasize Trevelyan's central role within the administration of famine relief, but also to show that in some ways he represented and had a really profound faith in a system that was already in place. And so to kind of personalize blame for the famine, I feel exculpates both the bigger structures of British imperialism and British colonialism, and also kind of exculpates like British imperialism as a whole, to say like it was this bad actor who had it out for the Irish. And so Trevelyan is, I sort of deliberately submerge his role a little bit. I mean, he also only went to Ireland, I think, once in his entire life, once during the famine for like yeah. I mean, I think in some ways Trevelyan is a way you could write a book about Victorian bureaucracy, and maybe there is a book to be written there just by looking at the way Trevelyan administered famine relief, where you can say something he believed that the Irish needed to work harder, but he himself worked unbelievably hard to do nothing, which is kind of one of the sort of tragic ironies of famine relief. But he sat in his office at the Treasury responding to thousands and thousands and thousands of letters from famine relief officials all across Ireland, where he was kind of, I describe it as he was almost like playing a tabletop board game, or like he's like playing Stratego by correspondence, imagining what was happening in Ireland through the mountains of correspondence that he was receiving from famine relief officials on the ground, and kind of coordinating famine relief that way. And I think that also is a typical, right? I mean, I think that is typical of British colonial administration, at least from London, as this kind of tabletop board game.
Yeah, or even other imperial centers. I mean, just going through records here in Mumbai from the 19th century, and if you look at famine records, you see much the same thing. I mean, correspondence is flowing into Bombay, and people are making decisions based on what's happening, 300, 400, 500 kilometers away. So it's I don't think it's not just an Irish thing, as you point out.
I think in some ways Trevelyan has become, he's in like the Fields of Athenry, right? The song that Irish sports fans sing whenever they play England, right? He stole Trevelyan's corn, then is sent to Botany Bay in the song, right? But no one was being sent to Botany Bay in 1846, anymore, right? The convictory was coming apart. in Australia in the 1840s. So in some ways, it's kind of that song, at least, is kind of combining different eras of British colonialism and imperialism in different parts of the world in a kind of overlap, like a sort of fantastical vision of how British imperialism worked. That I said that I think is probably morally true, but is not actually historically accurate. And yeah, I think that like Trevelyan is villainous only insofar as the system that he represented was villainous.
So, one very striking point you make in your book, and on the topic of Trevelyan and the famine relief administration that he helped preside over, was that the relief effort was not only incompetent, but that it was extremely cost ineffective. It spent so much money doing so little, which, I mean, just boggles the mind. I mean, how does one explain the fact that the British are talking about a need for austerity and yet spending a fortune to commit that austerity in an extremely inefficient and ineffective manner?
So importing maize at first is relatively cost effective because maize in 1845, 1846 is really cheap. And the United States produces an awful lot of it. And as I point out in the book, right, maize is one of the rotation crops with cotton. A lot of that maize is grown by enslaved labor, not all of it, unlike cotton, which is almost entirely grown by enslaved labor. There are free laborers growing maize as well. So it's just kind of an echo of previous work that I've done about the 1840s when British anti-slavery was rhetorically in the ascendant, but its embrace of free trade meant that it was piloting the British economy into deeper and deeper dependence on economies that produce raw materials using enslaved labor. So in that sense, that first wave was relatively, Britain didn't go into the red quite as much in the first wave, and a lot of the famine relief policies initially for paying for public works relied on loans, right? The idea was that famine relief agencies would be loaned money. And anytime there's an opportunity to loan money, right, the City of London is happy to make loans, especially when they're backstopped by the authority of the government of the United Kingdom, right? So I think there were some margins to be made there. But the problem was that the famine kept happening, right? The blight returned. The late blight organism, the water mold that causes late blight, came back in the harvest of 1846. And so fewer potatoes were in the ground, and a greater proportion of the potatoes that had been planted were blighted. And so there was no tax base remaining in Ireland that could possibly pay for the loans that had been extended. And so, the United Kingdom had committed itself to financing a program of public works that were designed not to lose money, but in fact to be profitable, right? That were designed to pay impoverished laborers less than the local market rate of wages. Well, that was one of the rules of the public works program. And this was in the poorest districts in Ireland. There virtually were no private market wages left, so it was all a fantasy. And there, the tax base that would have been able to pay back those loans no longer had any income coming in. The whole economy was beginning to crumble from beneath, and so the government of the United Kingdom, having committed itself to this, kind of got over its skis a little bit, more than a little bit, to the point where in March 1847, when the Public Works Program, which had been designed to be a kind of sort of like a workhouse vision of poor relief, something that was only for the most desperately poor, something for people with no other options, that was by design worse and lower paying than any other wage labor available in Ireland, was suddenly something that, more than 700,000 people were relying on for income. And those 700,000 people were supporting probably 2 million more, right? So in their families. So all of a sudden, a program that had been designed as a stopgap and a disciplinary measure of Irish labor was now more or less the only employer in the poorest parts of the Irish countryside. And the need for money to advance to the famine relief efforts that would, in theory, be paid back later with interest, forced the British government to start making tenders to borrow. And those tenders to borrow created a market panic that led to a run on the Bank of England in the spring of 1847 that forced Russell's government to pull the plug on the public works program in desperation. Right. So in some ways, right, the Britain had committed itself to a version of famine relief that was supposed to be austere, was supposed to be fiscally responsible, was supposed to be premised on the idea that the Irish would repay the loans that had been extended to them through the poor rates and through the proceeds of restarting the Irish economy. But the depth of the biological crisis of late blight made that impossible. And then all of a sudden, the loans that had never been supposed to be defaulted upon were suddenly defaulted upon. And then the very, very fragile structure of the Irish economy brought down the equally fragile structure of British financing of famine relief.
So, yeah, I was wondering if you could talk more about these workhouses. I mean, to me at least, this was the most difficult part to read in your book. I mean, just the descriptions sound horrific. And even by the standards of what would pass in famine relief camps in India, they sound terrible. You portray them as particularly hellish places, and places where things just don't seem to make sense also. I mean, you point out in one part of your book that in one workhouse, inmates were ordered not to grow food lest they intervene with market forces. So can you talk about what exactly was going on over here?
Yeah, so there had been workhouses in Ireland from 1838, 1839. The English Poor Law was amended in 1834, and the new Poor Law, as it was called, put into place a radically different system of poor relief in England that relied on the principle of the workhouse and of least eligibility, right? So the principle of least eligibility was that conditions within the workhouse had to be worse than the lowest paying free labor outside of the workhouse, right? To deter people from seeking relief within the workhouse. And the other principle of the English Poor Law was that no outdoor relief, as it was called, that is to say, relief without the requirement of being incarcerated in the workhouse effectively, was supposed to be possible for the English poor. But in England, that proved impossible and unsustainable. And so there were built into the English Poor Law exceptions where people could receive outdoor relief in times of special need. But in Ireland, under the Irish Poor Law, there was absolutely no outdoor relief permitted at all. And so it took, right, I think other historians, have maybe overpraised and overestimated the value of the soup kitchens that were established across Ireland in 1847. But even to set up soup kitchens required a pretty long debate in the House of Commons about amending the Irish Poor Law temporarily to allow outdoor relief of any kind. And so as the soup kitchens were winding down after the kind of worst year of the famine for Ireland as a whole, 1846, 1847, Black 47 as it's sometimes called, when I think the national crisis for Ireland was at its deepest, although maybe there were places in Ireland later that experienced equally profound crises, but they were much more regional and localized. As the soup kitchens wound down, John Russell and his government wanted to declare the famine over, right? I think I put it in an original draft of the book, but I think it was maybe too presentist. I cut it later. It reminded me a little bit of like George W. Bush on the aircraft carrier with mission accomplished behind him, when in fact the crisis of the Second Iraq War was really only beginning.
Appropriate comparison.
Yeah, I cut it. It seemed maybe I should have put it in. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But it was gone. But that was what I had in mind. Russell was, had to cut ties and say the crisis is over, and now the slogan was Irish property will pay for Irish poverty. So the Irish Poor Law unions will be responsible for collecting taxes from people who make enough money from rental income or from property that they own to be ratepayers, that is to say, to be taxpayers. And the poor law unions and their workhouses will manage the poverty of the Irish poor. But of course, the blight, 1847-48, was a relatively good year for blight. But there were hardly any potatoes left. And after 1847, there was hardly, society was still in a state of near collapse. And so the workhouses became the centers both of poor relief and of famine relief. And in parts of Ireland where the blight returned, and in some parts of Ireland, the blight returned worse in 1848, 1849, and 1849, 1850. And in some parts of Ireland, the crisis was even more profound in those years than it had been in Black 47. And so the workhouses became these centers of they became like, as you say, they were hellish, right? And is really the only adjective to describe them. And the workhouse itself was already a pretty brutal institution. and when the workhouse became the center of famine relief as well, it also became they also became centers of the spread of epidemic typhus, of violence, of sexual assault. Right? They were these like islands of carcerality, I guess, in a landscape of starvation in those 2 years. And that was really localized, right? In the parts of Ireland that had begun to recover from the famine, it worked, right? Worked is in inverted commas, but in parts of Ireland that had begun to recover from the famine, especially parts of Ireland that had in the north, in Ulster in particular, where there were other parts of the economy other than just agricultural products and potatoes, and where the blight was less extreme, it looked as though it was working. But in parts of Ireland, especially in the southwest, where the blight came back and where the crisis was even more profound, it was a kind of Black 47 in miniature with the workhouse at its center.
So at least 1 million people die during the famine. Over 1 million people immigrate in the short period when the famine takes place. And of course, as you mentioned, the numbers go up afterward. This obviously is a huge psychic shock to a relatively small country. And you describe folk memory from the famine. And you mentioned that it is, quote, wild and hallucinatory, end quote. Can you talk a little bit about how that folk memory is kept alive today?
I think there are distinctions between the folk memory of the famine for people in Ireland and people in the diaspora. So a lot of what I quote in the book is from a project that was launched by the Irish Free State in the 1930s and 1940s, where school children interviewed their grandparents and other elders and wrote down their recollections, not just of the famine, but of all kinds of stuff. So these archives they're all available digitally. They're in Irish and in English. They're really, anyone can use them for free. They're a really remarkable resource of public history. And so I've used that heavily. I also used collections of other 19th century primary sources of Irish folklore to try to get a sense of how the famine was understood. And there are all of these stories, there are tropes that repeat themselves over and over again of people eating money, right, to survive is one of them, people eating grass. There's all kinds of morality plays where, a virtuous widow prays and then boils rocks because she's going to try to make a kind of simulation of a meal for her children to make them feel better. And then a miracle occurs. And then when she empties the rocks out, it's actually a huge pile of potatoes. There are stories of people converting from Catholicism to Protestantism, and then, of moths beating their wings and extinguishing the candle at the foot of their bed and killing them in an instant, right? There's this kind of, there are these sort of, the reality of the famine becomes blended with the supernatural and both in a kind of Catholic religious sense, but also in an older pre-Christian sense in the memories of the famine. And in my own family, right, I think there are diasporic myths about the famine that have been passed down. And look, my dad's side of the family, or the Irish side, my mom was French Canadian, another complex, neurotic Catholic ethnicity or white ethnicity. But on the Scanlan side of the family, right, there were a couple of famine myths, and one of them was that people who had the surname Scanlan spelled with an O instead of an A were Protestant, or used to be Protestant, because they had taken the soup, right? They had accepted food from a soup kitchen in exchange for Catholic apostasy, right? They converted to Protestantism in order to eat, and they bore the mark of that shameful decision in their surnames, and they carried it into the present. And that's not true at all, right? It's purely a transliteration of an Irish name, Scanlan. It doesn't matter whether it's an A or an O. But that was something that, people in my family really believed. And, I think it connects to, and it is ahistorical, right? The soup kitchens were not, there's a lot of sectarian history, obviously, in Ireland, but there really weren't, except in very, very, as far as I can tell, except in very, very rare and localized examples of, people trading conversion to Protestantism for food. In 1849, there was a Protestant mission established to the west of Ireland that set up soup kitchens. But, it was never something quite so cruel and transactional, right? I think maybe you had to hear a sermon in exchange for food, but it wasn't like give up the Virgin Mary or die, So I think that there is this sense in which the famine lives on in all of these folkloric ways. And actually, one of the things that I've spoken to a lot, people have asked me, like, why don't you use the Great Hunger instead of the Irish Famine in your book? And I think in part that's because there is a kind of folkloric specificity of thinking about that, the Irish like hunger for potatoes as being unique and kind of almost supernatural. And I think that that is partly a folk memory and partly a creation of British colonialism, right? The idea of the Irish super appetite for potatoes is something that I write about in the book. And it's something that, I think appears in Irish folklore as well, but it always is often, in British colonial records, it's either 12 or 14, 10, 12 or 14 pounds of potatoes, which is per day for Irish adult, which is, an impossible quantity of potatoes for a human being to eat. And in Irish folklore, it's often 9 pounds of potatoes or 12 pounds of potatoes 3 times a day. So it has these kind of numbers of Christian theological significance and pre-Christian Irish mythological significance, right? Nine is the tripled, right? And so there's these kind of like lucky folkloric numbers that appear and are blended together with colonial records. And that's why I kind of shied away from using that language, because I feel it's hard to tease apart where the folklore begins and where the colonial record keeping ends.
Yeah, again, I mean, everything you say, I'm really struck by similarities with India. I mean, similar tropes are deployed. I mean, there are words of religious conversion as a means of famine relief, and ideas of maybe less so of Indian appetites or Indian hunger for particular goods, but there definitely is a lot about a lack of Indian work ethic or the supposedly backward nature of the Indian economy. So I mean, there's just so much fertile ground here to think about similarities. But as we come to the end of this particular episode, I want to ask you two questions, and the first question fits into kind of that world of comparative analysis. How do you feel the Irish famine, was part of a broader pattern of famines that you see across the British Empire in the 19th century? Of course, we have Mike Davis's work, Late Victorian Holocaust, that does a pretty fantastic job of doing that. But I mean, from your experience of having studied this particular episode, what do you think is the thing that kind of binds it together in the larger imperial whole?
I mean, I think it is ultimately there, and maybe it's ultimately kind of an unsatisfying or a kind of psychically unsatisfying answer. But I think there is a commitment across the British Empire and especially in the empire, right? I think in some ways to market solutions for things that are in fact market problems. That is something that is especially true in the empire, although it sometimes happens in Britain and in Britain proper. But it's easier, I think, to maintain that kind of market discipline in the colonized world as opposed to in Britain itself. But Britain is also subject to the same forces, just with less intensity. And I think that that's really what connects. That's one of the things that connects famines in the British Empire across the 19th century. One is a commitment to a kind of inability to see that the structures that intensifying the forces that caused famine in the first place is vanishingly unlikely to solve famine when it occurs, right? And I think you can see that in Ireland. I'm not an expert on the Bengal famines of the later 19th century, but from what I know, in part from Mike Davis and others, is that the solutions to famine conditions, which were not wholly caused by market forces, but were certainly exacerbated by them, was to try to pour on more gasoline right onto a fire, making a problem that was structural markedly more acute and worse in the short term. And that's one feature. And the second is a kind of willingness to see natural phenomena as being wholly outside of the world of human economy and human society. To say like, okay, and again, to use right in Ireland, right, like the arrival of Phytophthora infestans, of this organism that spread across the Americas and Europe from 1843 until 1850, and now is endemic everywhere that potatoes are grown, as is a kind of globalized pathogen, right? It's easy to kind of see that as an act of God, right? To say, the famine could not have been prevented because it was biological and it was accidental. Just as the changes in climate, for Mike Davis, it's the El Nino Southern Oscillation that causes famine conditions across Asia. That of course is a natural phenomenon, shaped by human contributions to the atmosphere, but ultimately not really in the control of any individual person. But still, acts of God are never acts of God, I think is one of the messages that I tried to bring across in Rot, which is that, a biological accident or a changing climate can affect the harvests in a particular place at a particular time. But food scarcity and famine are two different things. And famine is almost always a man made phenomenon that is distinct from the biological or climactic or accidental or atmospheric forces that cause a crop to fail. And I think that that's universal across the 19th century as well, right? And it's easy for imperial officials and local officials to blame crisis on the accidents of the natural world. But I think that ignores the fact that what actually makes famine are the structures in place that bring food to people's plates and keep them fed on a daily basis.
The last question I have for you is about the role of moral outrage in historical scholarship. I mean, it definitely comes out in your book. I think you've done a very effective job of letting the facts speak for themselves and let the facts do the part of eliciting the moral outrage. But I wonder, I mean, what you might think, having researched a topic that is obviously very difficult, right? And no doubt quite painful also to investigate, about what historians should do with something which is so morally outrageous. I mean, 180 years later, the shock of how badly this thing was managed and how racism and ideology, layered on top of one another, exacerbated a situation that already was bad. How do you think historians should deal with this? I mean, should we modulate moral outrage, or should we use it in different ways?
It's a really good question, and one that I'm not sure I've thought about systematically. Because on the one hand, right, I don't think that history, and this is something that I learned from writing about anti-slavery, especially British anti-slavery, which is kind of like tossed back and forth as people have started to write more about it. Roughly at the time that I was writing about it, it has become a kind of storehouse. It's become a kind of storehouse of morality, right? And for the right in Britain, it's become, the very fact that Britain abolished slavery and its slave trade relatively early in comparison to other major slave trading powers is taken as evidence of the probity of the British Empire. And it's kind of like at least better than the rest, right? And at the same time, I think others in the British Academy are kind of trying to mine the history of anti-slavery in Britain to find like news you can use, right? To find a usable past, right? To find in people like, very interesting and very like complex historical figures like William Wilberforce, like Olaudah Equiano, like these kind of key figures in the history of anti-slavery, to find in each of them a particular kind of moral heroism that I don't think is three-dimensional, right? I think that I'm cautious about mining the past for a kind of treasure house of moral lessons. But at the same time, I think what I'm trying to show in Rot and in my other work which is also deals with obviously like a world historically immoral and evil institution in Atlantic slavery, is to show the way that structures made it possible. You know what I mean? That people could be good or think that they were doing good while still contributing in a way to a system that was in Ireland starving people, in the Caribbean enslaving hundreds of thousands. And I think that is. I hope that's not morally paralyzing, because these systems are all obviously much bigger than any individual. But yeah, I mean that's where I stand. I mean, I think it's important to remember that the Irish famine wasn't just the work of a bunch of like sociopathic Brits on the ground in Ireland, because then it's easy to dismiss, right? It was something that the Irish famine was something that you know, the whole United Kingdom bore some element of responsibility for, and the whole British Empire. You know what I mean? So I think that relationship between the individual and structural forces is something that I've always been interested in as an historian. I don't have a, I'm sorry, that's a kind of an inconclusive way of ending the conversation. But I think that there are lessons there when thinking about moral issues in the present to understand that they are rarely the work of one individual, and that if you want to understand crisis, it's easy to individualize blame, but often most people, man doesn't make history. Man makes his own history, but he does not make it exactly as he chooses.
I think that's a good way to kind of sum up the response that you traced out in your book. So, Padraic, I'd really like to thank you for joining us today and talking more about a subject which is, I think, both extremely relevant and also extremely difficult to talk about at the same time.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It was a really good conversation.
Thank you.